What's up, everybody? I wanted to make a cool video showing you how you can swap your 6.0 sending unit to the 6.7 Powerstroke sending unit. Before I start the video, I want to be honest and tell you guys that I'm not too sure how this is going to work out at the very end. If anybody's interested, these are the part numbers and quantities provided to you when you buy the sending unit from Fleece Performance. There's a couple reasons why I decided to swap the sending unit.
The first reason being is that on the fleece unit, you have the option to change out the fuel line ports
With AN fittings or quick disconnects.
Also over here, this one has a dual feed and a dual return, and they're larger diameter tubes, where this one only has a single feed, a single return, and there is no fuel bucket. It is just purely a siphon tube and a return port.
Before I started making the video, I noticed a couple differences that kind of stuck out right off the bat. On the new gas tanks, Ford decided to get away from the original just big plastic nut style locking collar. Right off the bat that I'm going to have to address is the locking tab on the new one, which I am basically just going to chop that off using a handheld bandsaw. And if you look from the back side, if I can get my camera to focus, there is a little ledge, little profile on the bottom side of it, which you can use as a guide for cutting this locking tab off. The fleece unit is about a 1/4 of an inch shorter in length, which I don't think will be a problem.
and the top lid diameter is about 1/8 to a 1/4 different, but that doesn't change anything. On the fleece, we get about an even 6 inches.
On the stock, you get about 6 1/4. Fleece provides you with a new O-ring, but I think the easiest way to go about this is just to reuse the original 6.0 O-ring, which is less thick and it is a flat O-ring versus a rounded cord O-ring. I think the thickness of this O-ring would probably be a little bit too much and would probably space the sending unit a little bit too far off of the bottom of the tank. For conversation, the green O-ring does fit in this channel over here, but you might have to stretch it out a little bit just to make it fit before you get the sending unit on there, but it does fit. I tested it. The most important part is getting the fuel sending unit in the tank, in which it does fit. You just got to be careful of the level sensor, which you can kind of put it in at a little bit of a diagonal angle. Doing it on camera, I'm sorry. And it should go right in. Just don't force it. As you can see, that locking tab is the problem child in the situation, so there is no way to put the locking collar back on this tank without nipping that tab off. Now, I had thought about a couple ideas about maybe just making a slot for that tab to recess into here, but ultimately it doesn't serve much purpose because the original Powerstroke 6.0 sending unit allows you to clock your orientation, or the new 6.7s have it already pre-located for you with that locking tab right there. So as gently as I can, I'm going to take my handheld bandsaw and just follow the profile of this locking ring and chop off that tab altogether. Make sure it's flush. Alright, we're back from surgery. So remember, the race starts at the starting line, not in your garage. So the best place to begin when you're doing that first cut is before you even start cutting, just tape off everything so you don't scratch it or accidentally bump it when you're working with it. Just leave the part which you're trying to remove untaped so you have a clear defined line of what you're trying to remove and what you're trying to keep. That little Milwaukee bandsaw was all that I'd used to remove that locking lug, and then I just used a die grinder with a finishing wheel to clean up the edge really nicely. And as you can see, I did leave a little bit of meat on there. I just wanted it to be out of the way of the locking ring. I didn't really want it to be perfect, but it actually doesn't look all that bad, just leaving a little bit of meat on there. And then you just kind of come through on the edge and clean it up really nicely with a finishing wheel, and I'll show you what that looks like. I just used this die grinder with the flap wheel to get the meat of it roughed down, and I came through with the blue Scotch-Brite and then polished the edge so it's nice and smooth. And basically, if you do it all right and you take your time and you're patient, you won't even really notice that you cut it. It'll probably just look like a normal sending unit that was built for a 6.0 that's been upgraded. If you really want to clean that edge back up, you can take some black nail polish and just coat that edge, but it's aluminum, so there's really no reason to coat it. It's not going to rust, it's just not going to look pretty on that one edge, but you won't see it once you have it installed. So now that we're back over to the tank, make sure you put your 6.0 OEM O-ring on your tank. Don't use the 6.7 one. Carefully insert your sending unit, carefully. Drop it in just like that. And basically, despite that 1/4 inch or heavy eighth difference on the diameter of the fleece, you really can't actually tell. It looks like the O-ring and the top of it basically make full contact with each other, so there's really nothing to be worried about with that. And for the last step, you have to put the OEM 6.0 locking ring on your sending unit to keep it from moving around and to secure it in place. I highly recommend greasing the threads on these locking rings before trying to tighten it down. It's plastic on plastic. It's going to bind up if you try to put it on dry. So have some class. Use a little bit of lube. So after you grease it up, you can kind of start working it on. Now, this thing is pretty tight, so I'm going to have to do it off camera, but we'll come back here in a second. And this is what you're going to end up with. Now, we removed that tab there, so we have the ability to clock the sending unit however we feel fit for this application. The last remaining question is, how far does this sending unit reach to the bottom of the tank? And the only way we're going to be able to determine that is by using some sort of borescope or using a camera inside the tank. So let's go ahead and bust out the borescope and see if we are in fact all the way down in the tank, or if we had to figure out some kind of solution how we're going to make that work.
A few moments later.
So I went through hell to capture this footage for you guys today, but as you can see, that's the bottom of the tank right there, and that's the sending unit, and it pretty much ends up probably, I'd say safely, about 1/4 inch from the bottom of the actual fuel tank itself. Now I'm not too sure if Ford wanted the bucket resting on the bottom of the tank, or if they wanted it recessed just a little bit like that. So to figure this out, we're going to take the old sending unit and put it back in and compare the footage from the borescope. And if we need to lower the bucket a little bit to get the rest on the bottom, we'll go from there. So with the OEM Ford sending unit, it looks like that touches absolutely to the bottom. But mind you that those little nubs space it off of the bottom, so that way you don't accidentally block the flow by suctioning the bottom of the tank with your pickup straw. But it definitely touches the bottom, and I'm going to say, for conversation, it looks to be spaced off the bottom of the tank roughly the same as the Fleece Performance one. But if you really thought about it really long and hard and you wanted to make the bucket a little bit longer, I think there's something that could be done with these rails and the bucket itself. You probably could modify it just a little bit, nothing too crazy. Maybe extend the rod out or shorten the actual plastic piece and put a new pin in it, so that way it basically has that extra 1/4 inch of play, but I don't really think it's necessary. So we're almost to the end of the video here, but we have one more thing that I want to talk about. The original sending unit has a different style connector than the Fleece Performance one has. I think I have a pretty solid solution, which involves chopping the old connector off of the sending unit and then go ahead and buying yourself the male pigtail for a 6.7 Powerstroke of the year sending unit that you bought, and then splicing the two together. I strongly advise against connecting the sending unit directly to the frame rail harness. Going the extra mile and keeping everything plug and play is going to make servicing this truck a hell of a lot easier. Before I go chopping the harness connector off of this OEM one, I'm going to test the fuel level sensor, and I'm going to talk about that for a few seconds. I heard through the grapevine that your fuel level indicator will read backwards when you swap your sending unit.
The Fleece Performance does mount this little module 90 degrees counterclockwise, but from what I can gather, it looks to be in the same orientation when it's in full and when it's in empty mode, so that way it should read the same. If you don't know how these work, it's basically a giant resistor. As the fuel level rises, the resistance becomes decreased and it gives you a full indicator on your dash, and as it decreases, the resistance grows and slowly goes to empty.
On the fleece unit, you can see that this little component has been rotated, and you can also see the resistance marks that you will get when you're in whatever fuel position you're in, which will then go to your dash to tell you if you're empty or full in your tank. Those two little copper tabs right up and down on that resistor board, basically either increasing or decreasing the resistance as the arm travels. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. If you have a wire that's exposed in a fuel tank, will it short out the fuel indicator level? The answer is it shouldn't, and that's because fuel is typically non-conductive unless you have water in your fuel, and then it might be conductive. As long as you're only putting diesel fuel in your tank, these terminals will never jump their signal inside the fuel tank. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go grab the voltage meter and put it in the resistance setting, and let's check to see how many ohms we get when the tank is completely empty on this sending unit. And then we're going to do the same thing on the OEM one, and then we're going to compare. I might have misspoke earlier in the video talking about which way to increase or to decrease if resistance happens between full and empty in your tank, but we're going to go ahead and test that right now on camera. So currently the arm is all the way down, indicating that the fuel level is basically completely empty on this truck. So we're going to take our two probes. We have the voltage meter in ohms resistance, and we're going to be probing between these two terminals right there, and we're going to see what we get when the tank is completely empty. Pro tip, it appears as if they use some sort of sealant on top of the solder where those wires terminate, so you need to touch your probes to the actual resistor board itself in order to get the reading. So it's going to be a little bit tricky to do, but let's get it done right now. Okay, so at full close we have 180 ohms. Half tank is about 6 ohms. And all the way full is basically no ohms. So meaning that this sending unit, the way it's reading is when this float rises all the way to the top, indicating the fuel level is 100% full, it can pass all of its voltage and has no resistance back to the indicator saying that you're at a full position. That's the fleece. So let me reiterate, when the tank is full, there's zero resistance, power can flow completely freely through that indicator. So I may have misspoke earlier in the video. I had thought that when it was empty, resistance would read the most and then vice versa, or however I said it. The reason why I'm mentioning it now in the video is because I was right and I was wrong. The grapevine ended up being true, that if you go ahead and just try to drop this sending unit in as is, it will just read backwards. So when you're full, it'll be empty. When you're empty, it'll be full. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This is the original OEM 6-liter sending unit, and right now it's empty, quote unquote. And let's hook up the probe and see what we get here. So as you can see, we have pretty much no resistance when it's completely empty, meaning that all the voltage is passing through. And let's increase it a little bit. And it stops, and then we start to grow in resistance. And then it looks like this one in particular maxes out at about 160 ohms, where the other one maxed out at 180. I don't know if that's going to be a problem or not. But I can tell you that if it reads backwards, that's going to be a problem. So let's go ahead and see if we can figure this out. This may be the easiest solution ever, actually. So on the fleece, you can actually slide this little unit out by pressing down on that little locking tab. And you look in the back of it, it's just nothing special. It's mirrored on both sides, and that's the way it came. And if you look, the float valve is parallel or horizontal with the bottom of the bucket. So it's pretty easy. And then when it's all the way full, you're pretty much, whatever, you're all the way full. Nothing really too fancy about that. But what you can do is you can easily just slide this whole thing out and then position it properly. So you can flip it around 180. So that way, full is empty, empty is full by the resistor board standards. And then there you go. Now, it doesn't necessarily look exactly how fleece level was set, but you could easily tweak the fuel level indicator float by just bending the wire however much you need it. But basically, this is super close to the original indicator level. So the only thing I would see you'd have to do is maybe you would have to bend this arm out a few degrees so that it's parallel with this part. And then when it rises all the way up, as you can see, it actually rises almost more perfectly, because that's a word, when it's in this orientation than the original one. So that ain't bad. So the way it should work is that when the fuel float is all the way down, my meter should beep and we should have almost no resistance. And when we have it at full, it should have lots of resistance and it should stop beeping. And we have about 3 ohms at about half tank. Looking good. And we have about no ohms at completely empty, which is exactly what we're looking for. One downside to flipping your fuel level indicator sensor is getting the assembly back into the tank as one piece can be a little bit challenging. So what I did was I had the gray sensor piece slipped off of the orange bucket, and I got everything into the tank. And then once I had everything inside of the tank, I was able to slip that fuel indicator piece back onto the orange bucket. So let's wrap this video up. In order to do the 6.7 Powerstroke sending unit swap, you're going to need to get yourself a sending unit. I prefer the fleece one. You're going to have to nip off the nub right there. Make sure you take your time on that. Don't fuck that part up. You're going to have to flip over your fuel flow indicator level switch. And this is completely up to you. But if you want to make sure you get everything properly indicating, make sure you bend the float switch parallel with the bucket so that way it knows exactly where it's at as far as fuel level goes. You don't want that telling you have fuel in the tank when you don't. You definitely don't want that. So make sure you get that dialed in properly. I convert this plug from your factory one to the 6.7 one, and you should have yourself a 6.7 sending unit with whatever AN or line size you want on your old 6.0 Powerstroke. Right on, guys. Have a great day.